Rembrandt van Rijn was the greatest artist of the Dutch Golden Age.
One of the great masters of the 17th century.
He was a confident artist, and his brushwork is done with immediacy.
Rembrandt was in great demand as an artist for most of his life, but he always found time for self-portraits.
There's a strong tradition of artists painting self-portraits, but certainly Rembrandt is very prolific.
In total, we have about 80 self-portraits by the artist, which is an incredible number for any artist of any period.
Until then, artists who'd done self-portraits might have done one or two, possibly a handful.
These incredible paintings capture key moments throughout his life and show just how much his style changed over the years.
There's no other artist. You have this biographical sense of, I know this person. He lays it all out. He doesn't hide who he is.
But despite the fame and success that Rembrandt enjoyed during his life, his career ended in bankruptcy. He died in poverty, but his reputation would only grow and grow in the centuries after.
He's never not been a famous artist.
Despite his never leaving the Netherlands, his paintings today are spread throughout the globe.
If you want to have a collection that is an important collection, you need a Rembrandt.
But it's been a battle to try and piece together his true legacy by finding all of his works and separating the real Rembrandts from the many copies.
Choose only one master, nature.
Rembrandt was born in Leiden, and he actually started going to university there, and then he changed direction.
He then went to Amsterdam, where he was an apprentice for the artist Peter Lastman, where he was for a couple of years.
Amsterdam in the 17th century was the wealthiest city in the world, as the Dutch Golden Age was in full flow. The possibilities were limitless.
Peter Lastman was a history painter. He painted stories of the Bible, mythology, and that was, in fact, the level of what one wanted to be as an important artist. If you're going to be an important artist, you had to be a history painter, because a history painter dealt with the imagination.
He completed his training when he was 18 at a fairly young age.
And he comes back to Leiden, and it's interesting, there's a contemporary of Rembrandt's who's very important to the early Rembrandt. His name is Jan Levens. They get a slight reputation early on in The Hague, which is where the court is, the aspirations to build up the importance of the Dutch court. And the person leading that effort is a wonderful individual by the name of Constantijn Huygens.
He was a courtier, he was a poet, a musician, a secretary or advisor of art, actually, to the Prince of Orange. So he went to the workshop and was impressed with their output, their work. The Prince of Orange has had Rembrandts in his collection, so obviously he commissioned and bought works from Rembrandt. Huygens holds him in kind of high esteem, so that couldn't have hurt his career, certainly at that point, at a young age.
Rembrandt was in an ideal situation. He was painting for the Dutch royal court and had the favour of Constantijn Huygens, a powerful figure who would be knighted by both the English and French royal families, and whose son Christian would become one of the greatest scientists of the era. It was in a letter to Constantijn that we have the only record from Rembrandt of what he was striving to accomplish in his art: the greatest and most natural movement. In just his early 20s, Rembrandt's future seemed secure for life, and it's at this point that he paints his very first self-portrait.
He painted his first self-portrait, as far as we know, at the age of 22, quite young. And he probably did this partly as an exercise in chiaroscuro, looking at the effect of light and shadow in a painting. And when you look at the self-portrait, most of his face is in the dark, but the right side of his cheek and the right ear are in the light, brightly illuminated.
Many of Rembrandt's earlier self-portraits, and especially the ones that he made when he was in his 20s, are much more radical, they're much more dramatic, because in those works, he's exploring artistic expressions and possibilities.
Head's almost in complete shadow. I mean, it's very dramatic. He was obviously experimenting with light techniques at the time.
He's very deliberately catching himself in a moment of extreme emotion or passion and trying to give an idea of what an angry expression looks like. This is a very polished, accomplished statement.
Rembrandt painted self-portraits for a number of reasons. I think he partly did it as a form of advertisement, if you like, to show potential clients how well he could do portraits. Other self-portraits were done for much more personal reasons, to record how he was feeling or how he felt he looked at a particular point in time.
Without atmosphere, a painting is nothing.
Rembrandt was an established name in the rapidly expanding city of Amsterdam. He had achieved success so early that he was taking on students while still in his 20s. These included other great artists of the Dutch Golden Age, including Gerrit Dou and Govert Flinck. But this process has made deciphering the works of Rembrandt from those of his disciples very difficult, nearly 400 years later.
He has people come study with him. And so that develops a large studio. Then there are a lot of attribution issues that develop as works coming out of the Rembrandt world during the 1630s, particularly. Are they all painted by Rembrandt, or are they painted by Rembrandt and people from the workshop? Are they blocked in by Rembrandt and then built up by other people? What we do know is that there are a lot of artists whose names are pretty familiar in the Rembrandt world. Flinck is Govert Flinck. Ferdinand Bol, Jacob Bakker. But while they're with Rembrandt, you can't really tell. So there is a kind of a working relationship that is very complicated.
Try to put well in practice what you already know, and in so doing, you will, in good time, discover the hidden things which you now inquire about.
Even the self-portraits sometimes can't escape the confusion of just who painted them, as Rembrandt's students copied his self-portraits as part of their training. They had a lot to work from as Rembrandt continued to make new versions of his own likeness throughout the majority of his career.
The painting behind me is one of Rembrandt's most well-known self-portraits. It was painted in 1640 when he was 34 years of age. He was, at that moment, really nearing the peak of his popular success as a painter in the city of Amsterdam. And I think that moment in his life really dictates how that particular self-portrait works. He is very consciously trying to present himself as an elegant, accomplished artist who's really at the peak of his game. He's based his pose and details of his costume on very well-known paintings by Raphael, by Titian, and by Lucas van Leyden and Albrecht Dürer. So people looking at this self-portrait in the 17th century would have recognized that Rembrandt is putting himself on the same level as these great artists of the previous century.
The 1640s started off as a glorious time for Rembrandt. He and his wife Saskia, who featured in several of his paintings, had moved into a newly built home that still stands today as the Rembrandt House Museum. Their son Titus was born in 1641, and in his studio he had what many people believed to be his greatest student, Karel Fabricius. But Fabricius's career would be cruelly cut short when he was killed in the huge gunpowder explosion of Delft, and most of his paintings were lost forever. We have only 12 remaining to this day. And just as the story ended tragically for the student, so too for the master.
In the 1640s, all sorts of things happen in Rembrandt's life. He becomes less active in this broader marketing of his works. The style changes, he becomes less extrovert and more introverted, and he goes off on long walks in the countryside, makes these beautiful landscape drawings and landscape paintings.
The second half of his career, he goes through a period of trying to identify what more he could achieve as an artist. What was most important to him? What goals did he really want to pursue during the second half of his career?
By moving away from the style of painting that was popular at the time, Rembrandt's reputation started to fade, and he was eventually struck down by bankruptcy. His works would have to be sold off, and he would die in poverty. Slowly but surely, though, his amazing output, including the self-portraits, would be tracked down and his legacy restored. The second half of Rembrandt's life was filled with tragedy. His wife, Saskia, died when he was 35, and his only child that survived infancy, Titus, would also die before him. Even his status as an artist had begun to slip as he moved away from the fine, detailed style of painting that was popular at the time.
Of course, you will say I ought to be practical and ought to try and paint the way they want me to paint. Well, I will tell you a secret. I have tried. And I have tried very hard, but I can't do it. I just can't do it. And that is why I am just a little crazy.
Rembrandt's reputation is a fascinating study, both during his lifetime and after his death. Towards the end of his life, Rembrandt continued painting in a certain style that found favor with a great many patrons, but other people favored a much more elegant, smoother style. So even during his lifetime, there was a little bit of a mixed reception to his works.
Rembrandt painted very quickly. I mean, he was a confident artist. His brushwork is done with immediacy, and this was quite unlike many other Dutch artists at the time, known as the fine painters, who used polished technique to get a very realistic but slightly dull impression. And Rembrandt was much bolder and expressionistic in the way he worked.
For a period of roughly 7 years, though, Rembrandt seems to have abandoned self-portraits altogether while he worked on a great range of other subjects. But in 1652, he returns to the genre with gusto, and from then on averaged roughly one self-portrait a year until his death in 1669, with works that captured the aging process of an artist like no other.
Life etches itself onto our faces as we grow older, showing our violence, excesses, or kindnesses.
I think he thought about his self-portraits and indeed the rest of his artistic production as a refuge from the realities of everyday existence. In many of his later self-portraits, he looks aged, he looks haggard.
The self-portraits were not unflattering. They were realistic. I mean, he was keen to capture the effects of aging that occurs to anyone who survives into old age. So he was being a realist.
Rembrandt's an old gentleman at this time, so he's being shown with these wrinkles and all, and that gives a sort of immediacy to the painting. I think as you look at it, you can relate to it.
At that point, Rembrandt's manner of painting had become very rough when he puts the paint down on the canvas. So he has a thick paints on his brush. He doesn't work with a lot of smoothing out those elements. However, it's interesting that he focuses your attention on the face, and that roughness of execution is really limited to that area. The hat and the body are, much more smoothly rendered. So there's a selectivity of where he applies that kind of painting technique.
Another one of Rembrandt's masterpieces that he painted in the twilight of his career is the self-portrait with two circles, now at Kenwood House. The painting retains a mystery to this day as to just what the two circles in the background are meant to represent.
There's lots of theories. They possibly relate to two circles from world maps that you would have found in interiors, and you often see them in other paintings of the period. And it was around this time, early 50s, 53, that a printed world map came out, so it would be the two hemispheres. That's one possibility. The other, it refers to Vasari's Lives of the Artists, where Giotto, the Renaissance artist, proves his worth to the Pope by drawing a circle freehand in one brushstroke. So that's also a popular one, although I think less convincing because the circles aren't complete and they're not done with one sweep of a brushstroke.
Rembrandt remains elusive to the very end. In fact, with many of his later self-portraits, we're not even certain if the paintings are fully finished.
The question of what is finished with Rembrandt is a fascinating question. We have to assume that, yes, at a certain point, all right, this says what I want this painting to say. And when you have a painting that's as roughly executed as this, and one could imagine that somebody, oh gosh, I got to smooth this out and make it a little bit better. You don't feel that at all the case here.
It isn't signed and dated. He might not have considered it complete. Also, how he's treated the hands in the painting. It's very fast brushwork, very sort of broad sweeping strokes. But my feeling is that that was his technique. That's what he was wanting. When you step back from the painting, it all kind of gels and hangs together well. You're not meant to view the painting up close. So I would err on the side of that it is complete.
A painting is finished when the artist says it is finished.
In these later self-portraits, along with a clear change in Rembrandt's painting style, we can also clearly notice that his clothes are far humbler than the finery he wore in his earlier works, which is no surprise given the huge financial difficulties that Rembrandt faced later in his life.
In 1656, Rembrandt was declared bankrupt. He was very bad at organising his financial affairs. And at that point, all his possessions and artworks were sold off.
But basically had overspent. He was, spending beyond his means with his own collection. He got this huge house, which he just couldn't afford, really. So, it basically caught up with him.
Thanks to the fact he became bankrupt, we have an inventory from 1656 which recorded his possessions. And they list over 50 paintings, including works by famous artists such as Van Eyck and Howells. And he was quite an eclectic collector, so he had other things as well. He had Japanese armor and Roman antiquities and other pieces.
He was actually at a very difficult stage of his career. He had to move out of his house, he had to sell his house, sell his collection, and move into smaller quarters.
When he died, all his pictures had been dispersed, and that would have been to hundreds of owners. So that's why the paintings are found all over Europe and North America.
Rembrandt died in poverty in 1669. Not only had he lost all of his money, but his reputation had dimmed considerably from his heyday.
Immediately after his death, Rembrandt was still and consistently very well respected as a printmaker, but as a painter, his sort of rough and almost expressionistic works were not so much in favor until about the mid-19th century.
Rembrandt was always seen as one of the great artists of the Dutch Golden Age, but it was really in the 19th century that he became increasingly famous and well regarded.
With the rise of an interest in contemporary French art and the art of other nations as well, an interest in realism and, portraying things as they were, no matter how rough or ugly or plain, that's when artists started getting interested again in Rembrandt.
If you want to have a collection that is an important collection, you need a Rembrandt. Particularly for the collectors that are important for the National Gallery, that was definitely the case.
US banker Andrew Mellon helped found the National Gallery in Washington, which opened in 1937. And from the start, Rembrandt was always at its core. Upon his death, Joseph E. Widener, another prominent collector of the time, left his entire collection to the National Gallery. Over a dozen of the works were Rembrandt masterpieces.
Rembrandt is an artist which any museum or gallery of old masters wants to acquire. Most Rembrandts now are in museums and they're scattered all over the world, obviously particularly in Europe, America and Russia.
The reason Rembrandt is so sought after and admired is that although his technical and artistic ability is greatly revered, it is through his self-portraits that we can appreciate the person that is Rembrandt. In viewing this extensive body of work, it allows us to witness and live out the fascinating, exciting, and ultimately tragic story of one man's life.